And yeah, Gold Coast is getting a bit soggy too. It's great. Yeah. Okay, so I've got the record button on, and before we start, has anybody got any critical questions they want to ask? You're all quiet. Does that mean that you're all out of questions or you don't have any questions? It's been quite quiet on the forums recently, so it sounds like you found your feet. And I can see a couple of people nodding. That's awesome. Okay, so let's kick off, and I'm going to start with the share screen. So there we are. Okay, so welcome to week 3, and this week I want to just go over the peer feedback process and make sure that you're comfortable with the process as we're envisaging it. A little bit of troubleshooting, as Lauren brought up. We need to just have a look at a couple of things that are going wrong, and then we'll move into the assessment and make sure that you're on top of the assessment, because this week really is pretty content free except for the readings, and the readings articulate into your assessment. One thing I don't have now that I'm sharing my screen is a chat, so I'm really sorry if you've got any questions that you wanted to put up in the chat, because I'm not going to see them, but I will drop back and check every now and again. Or if you've got a question, just interrupt me and we'll deal with the question then, because I won't be able to monitor that chat. So basically, peer evaluation. First of all, yes, look, you know that you're in a group of 4, and I've put up in Moodle, in the Design Challenge forum, a little Word document that stopped at person number 30. I'll upgrade that now that we're beyond 30. That just counts you off in numbers so that you don't have to scroll up and down trying to count who's who. So I'll just keep updating that to make sure that that you know. Just turn my phone on mute because it's annoying me. There you go. So that you know which group you're working with. But one of the things that is going wrong to a degree in the group is that you're working in your group of 4, but some people are giving feedback to the wrong person in the group. So what I'm asking you to do is just be, just see what you can fix yourselves as a group, and email everybody else in the group and just see who hasn't got feedback, and see if you can work that out between you as a foursome. If you can't work that out, I'll jump in and see what we can sort out. In terms of the feedback, I absolutely love the feedback that's coming in because it's so positive, but it's also so constructive. So thank you very much to everybody who's given the feedback. As I go through your websites, I'm just astounded at the quality of what you've done in your design challenge, sort of way beyond what we expected you to do, which is just fantastic. And it's because you've chosen to do something to that degree of detail. So thank you very much for that. The thinking processes are amazing, and the communication and documentation is fantastic. When you're doing your evaluation, just look, you don't have to be expect too much from the person you're evaluating. It's presence and relevance of each of the elements that we're looking for, not necessarily the comprehensiveness of the elements as they've addressed them. So just that they have followed some sort of process, or no, not necessarily, they've reported a process, and that process aligns with the stages in the design process. That's what we're looking for, and the feedback that's coming back is exactly spot on. What's fantastic is that the early people who've come in have provided models for the later people to come in, so that you can look at the way that feedback has been framed, and you can look at the websites and get an idea of what people are doing, which certainly helps you with yours. So thank you to the early people, because that certainly helps the later people as they put their stuff up. So now we're going to move on to assessment 1, and remember there are 3 parts of assessment 1. The first one is the reflection on the design process that you've drawn from the design project that you've done and the peer feedback exchange. And remember now, in that reflection, we are relating it to learning about the technology design process specifically. So yes, I know at times you're uncomfortable giving peer feedback, and I do appreciate that. That's something for you to think about when you go into your classroom, and it could be a critical question that you actually focus on for your second part of assessment 1. But really we're focused on learning about the design process through doing it. And already the sort of information I'm getting from people is, I've reported this design process and I've reported it according to the stages in the process, but this isn't necessarily the way I did it. I actually went straight in and cooked it until I got something I liked, and then I backtracked and I actually refined it sort of backwards. So these are the sorts of things that you'll probably come up with. You may come up with, I followed the design process. I found it quite easy to follow. You may come up and say that I communicated it well and the peer evaluator had no comment, which is fabulous. You may come up and say that, in fact, your communication left gaps and you should have done that, but you just didn't think about that. And so this is where the evaluator came in and made you rethink. But whatever you do, in that first part, just show me that you understand the technology design process. That's what we're looking at. So there were so many questions in the forum about the whole design process, and I just wonder why. Can anybody explain why we actually had so many problems and questions? Anybody just want to pop in? Because that forum got really, really busy for a while, and it's probably about a quarter as busy as my emails were and the phone calls that came in. And it's simply because the design process possibly didn't adequately support the actual processes involved in the task. So there was something of a gap that you actually had to fill in between this is what's on paper and this is what I'm actually doing. And that's also something that you can reflect on as well as you put together your reflection for assessment 1A. So that's the first part of the assessment. Has anybody got any questions about that? It's fairly straightforward. Okay, great. Now, assessment 1B, that's the middle part of the task. Remember, we're asking you now to step into that assessment, and we're asking you to identify 2 critical questions. Just scroll through it so that I've got it in front of me. So yeah, you've got 2 critical questions about technology in your classroom with particular reference to your design challenge and how you're going to make that happen if you did it in a classroom. So the first thing you have to do basically is look at the Australian curriculum and identify in the curriculum where you believe that particular design challenge would fit in terms of the year levels. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with the curriculum at the moment, but I'll just open it up. And I'll share with you. So I'll go back and share the curriculum. Okay, so there's the curriculum there. And basically, if you go into design and technologies down the left-hand side, you come into what's, I suppose, essentially a scope and sequence. So it's your curriculum all the way from foundation all the way through to year 10. Now, my suggestion is when you're trying to map your project against the curriculum, you go into the content descriptors, because we've actually looked at the process and production skills already through your design process. Now we're jumping back and saying, okay, how does it map against knowledge and understanding? So, we can go into, let's say, year 2 descriptors, and let's look at the elaborations of those descriptors. So basically, household packaging representing other objects, that certainly could be your push-pull car. Dealing with materials, tools and equipment to discover potential uses when making products or modelling services and environments, for instance, when designing and making toys. So it could certainly fit in that little toy car with the year 1 and 2 class quite comfortably, and you could then describe how you would implement that in your classroom. If I go through to year 3 and 4, and we look at forces and properties of materials, again, Woomera design is a sort of a push-pull toy, so if you wanted to focus more on the forces, you could certainly look at the forces involved in push-pulling. You could certainly look at the forces up here, examining models, how forces and materials are used in the design of a toy, so you can see how that toy would fit in with that. Experimenting with materials and so forth, so that would fit in beautifully there. If I went in to year 3 and 4 and looked at food and fibre production, we could certainly look at food for health, and that would certainly cover the menu design. Or we could go up to 5 and 6 for food and fibre production and look at, there it is. food guides, food policies, food choices, experimenting with ingredients for selected groups for healthy eating. So you can see as you go through those elaborations, that's where you're likely to find the links that you'll make to your curriculum. And then if you go backwards again, this will be your curriculum outcomes. So you'll pick up this particular one or that particular one and just cite that before you actually start that middle section of the assessment. Does that make sense? Yeah, can you just nod or give me some? Yeah, okay, beautiful. Thank you. So I'll just stop sharing and go back again to the presentation then. And back again. So basically you'll go into your curriculum learning area, and I've just got a little pathway there. So if you go into the introduction, subjects, design and technologies, into the content descriptions, that's where you'll be able to find the links. So you'll look at your whichever project you did and decide, this I'm going to do in this particular year level, and this is the content area that I'm going to address. So basically we don't have to assume that because we've gone through anyway, but those elaborations are really a good place to get insight into what the content is all about. So I suggest you start with the elaborations and backwards map, and it'll give you a good idea of what this content is about. Okay, so you started assessment 1B by identifying the age and year level that you're going to implement that, and now you have to think, okay, if I run the same design project in my nominated classroom, what are the sorts of things I'm going to have to think about? And to one side, if we say to the left-hand side of your page, you're looking at your design project itself thinking, you know, these are critical things, safety is critical over here, multiple ways of expressing this project is problematic over here, having the right ingredients, for instance, for menu design, that might be problematic. Getting them to think in the right way could be problematic in this unit. So you've got some ideas that have come out of doing your design challenge. And what we're going to ask you to do is meet head on what the experts have already told us about this curriculum itself. So you're going to sort of meet in the middle and find two things that meet quite well in the middle. So you've done some readings already. You've looked at Mawsome. Is that too small? Can you see that okay? Yeah, okay. So Mawsome basically came out with a number, oh sorry, this is the curriculum aims first. The curriculum aims comes out with some fairly critical statements, and it's worthwhile looking at those aims and actually highlighting the key components of those statements and thinking about the implications. For instance, how do we support our children to be critical users of technology? So if we're asking them to use the tools or play with toys, how can they be critical users of toys and actually make decisions about how these toys could be improved? So they're users and they're producers, and those producers of design solutions probably is the aim of what you're looking at. How do we get them to be innovative? That's a real problem. You know, they've been told all the time, they're at school, they're here, they conform, they do everything the way they're supposed to do it. And then we're turning around in technology and say, guys, lift the lid off this. Let's be really innovative. Let's be really creative. Let's do something nobody's ever thought about before. How do we support that in our children? How do we teach them to be ethical? You know, in terms of, you know, the things that they're using, in terms of, let's say, the iPhones that we're using and the fact that we all upgrade iPhones all the time. Could they actually look at a feature of an iPhone that actually makes it recyclable and therefore more ethical? Systems and design thinking. How do we teach them how to use design thinking? And that design thinking goes down to the process skills that you've actually used in your projects. How do we help them communicate that thinking? Because kids are not necessarily really good communicators. And one of the major problems that you guys have come up with and communicated in emails to me is, how do I actually communicate that? How do I express that? And what you've got there in your Weeblies is these amazing flowcharts, fabulous concept maps, fabulous images, beautiful videos. These are all ways of communicating to a range of audiences. These are things that you're going to have to work with your children and developing your children as well. So how are you going to do that in your classroom? How are we going to get them to be sensible users of materials? Where do we find those materials? What sort of materials are we looking at? Are we just looking at textiles, fabric, cardboard? In terms of the kitchen, we're looking at materials that are actually edible materials. You know, how do we teach them how to beat an egg and what an egg is in the kitchen? Things like that. So it's not just playing around with cardboard, wood and things like that. How do we actually work with wood and timber in the classroom, depending on what your project is? How do we get them, and this is problematic, and we've addressed this before, how to get them to actually work creatively with tools and equipment. There's a built-in hazard there, isn't there? If we're saying you follow the rules and use the equipment the way we're telling you to use it, and they have a creative way to use a hacksaw, where do you draw the line and say, gee, that's creative, but that's hazardous? That's creative, but you can manage the hazard, or that's creative, but I'm not going to allow you to do that. How do we teach them how to be competent with tools? And if that's the case, we have to have tools in our classroom. So it's easy in an early years classroom. I mean, scissors are a tool. How do you teach them to use scissors appropriately? How do you teach them to use blades? But eventually you may do timber projects with your children. You may work in a garden with your children. How do you actually teach them to work with those tools so that they become users of equipment and technology and they're competent? And it's easier said than done, because children these days, a lot of them have very, very poor fine motor skills. So when you're working with equipment with them, you've actually got a number of barriers that you've got to break before allowing them to work with that equipment safely. And how do you help them manage a process? So it's all very well when you give them a recipe and you say, go out and do this. But if they've got their recipe and they've made the decision about what they have to do, how do we actually support them in actually managing that process? It becomes very complex. And then how do they actually evaluate processes? So this is the peer evaluation process that we're doing. How would you actually bring that peer evaluation into your classroom? Because it's easy enough for us to do it. How hard is it for your kids to be objective about what they're looking at? How easy is it to have protocols in your classroom to help them be critical without being critical? It's very, very hard. And then roles and responsibilities of people in the design industry. So they are taking on roles themselves. How do we actually support them in taking those roles on? And then as they take those roles on, how do we connect them to people in industry to understand the roles of those people in industry? So very much about crossing boundaries outside the classroom and bringing them into connection with real people out there. So there are some critical questions in there that you may want to pick on and develop further for assessment 1. And then at the same time, what did Mawson say? Well, you've done Mawson, that was last week, and you came out, and the big thing with Mawson simply is that he was very critical about the design process and said that schools tend to use it as a recipe, and that is seriously problematic. So he came out with a suggestion that instead of the design process, we actually look at basic elements of design. And I think that's very much what you did. I don't think any of you actually followed that process. I think you went first, looked at what you were going to make, dabbled back and did your needs analysis, jumped back again and looked at that bit, then jumped back and looked at that bit. I don't think many of you would have gone linear through that process and just developed each step as you went, because that's not the way we actually develop things. So did you come up with a recipe and follow that recipe, or did you actually come up and fiddle in the kitchen until you had a recipe and then went back and modified the base recipe that you had? How do you, again, Mawson is very critical that there is a very fine line between guiding your children and being prescriptive. So that when you start in the early years, you are very, very guiding. You've got a very good structure that they follow so that they learn how to follow processes with some individualization in the middle. When you get to year 6, your guidance should be over, basically, and those kids should be self-motivating and self-initiating. And somewhere in the middle, between years 3, 4, and 5, and year 6 and year 1, you've got some, you know, if you over-prescribe, you're no longer a guide, you're telling them what to do. If you don't guide them well enough, they're going to get lost. Where do you find that balance? So that's another critical issue. Then the next thing is, you know, I know that you guys didn't follow the design process. You can't con me, because I know the people I've spoken to, and they've been talking about the things they've done, and they didn't start off with a needs analysis. They went straight in and did the design. and then went back on the needs analysis. So how do you actually balance what kids really do? Because kids are going to do the same. They're going to get in and get their hands dirty. They're going to get feathers and stick them on cardboard, see what they look like, pull them around, change them around, and then they'll report to you the design process. So they'll tell the teacher one thing, they'll do one thing themselves. How do you actually reconcile and balance that? And teach your children to actually work with the processes without following the process, if you like. That's a difficult question. Mawson has a problem with that as well. In terms of problems, Mawson thinks that really problem finding is more important than problem solving in the curriculum area. So again, how do you teach your children how to find problems? It's quite easy, for instance, in the utensils task, to go and talk to somebody who has to use those utensils and work out what is the problem with using this utensil. That's problem finding. So somewhere in your classroom, you'll teach them how to solve problems, but on occasions in your classroom, you'll teach them to find problems and then look for solutions for problems. That could be a critical balance that you want to look at with your task. The role of the teacher is critical. And Mawson highlights that the way you model and you think out loud, and you model the thinking processes, and you model how to find information, and you provide critical but supportive commenting. Mawson goes into quite a deal of depth on the role of the teacher in the classroom. And that, again, is a critical question you could ask, and certainly use Mawson as reference. What is your role as a teacher in a design technologies classroom? Sometimes you teach explicitly, and you can go down all of this. Sometimes you prescribe, sometimes you guide. Sometimes you teach the design process. Sometimes you teach them how to solve problems. But for the most part, eventually you'll relinquish control to them and you become the model. And they follow the model that you set. So you've got to live that, which is why we've asked you to do this design challenge. You've got 32 kids in a class and they're all doing their own thing because that's what we want them to do, more or less, with a little bit of guidance. How do you manage time in your classroom? That is a critical question. Do we actually have, like we've done in this course, critical junctures where we expect a process to be complete? So that we don't set their timeline up. We say, by the end of week 2, you should have your design brief there. Set up your timetable so you reach that particular timeline. How do you manage time in your classroom? And then how do you deal with a variety of creative outcomes? How many creative outcomes can you deal with in a classroom? How can you leave it open-ended? For instance, one of the things you can do is give them a finite selection of materials, and they'll be constrained by the materials, so that you actually limit the number of potential outcomes simply because there are not enough materials or diverse materials sufficient to come up with something that new, that it's unmanageable. And then the other thing is, if you are asking them to come up with their own plans, how do you manage materials and forward planning? Because for the most part, you don't go out shopping the day before you actually do the task. You work in the head. And if they come up with a plan and you don't have the materials, how do you constrain that and manage that without limiting their creativity? How do you plan forward? That's a question. It's a hard question. And certainly Mawson didn't come up with any answers. So those are some questions that came out of Mawson. Yep. Then we've got Jones, Bunting and DeFries. And they came up with a couple of really important things that lead to key questions. The first one is linking technologies with society. So if you've done a menu design, or let's say you've done a push-pull toy design, how do you actually link that project with society? How do those children actually get a sense that this is what I've designed, it's only a little cardboard toy, but it links into society and the technological society because of? How do you actually work with them to understand that what they've designed leads to technological gain for the benefit of society? Are they going to make their toy for an audience? Are they going to make their toy for a group of other children? Are they going to make that toy so that it goes into a little toy library for younger children? And that just brings in a social purpose to their toy. They need to understand the learning processes rather than focusing only on the content? That's a critical question that you work with your children, that it's not about the actual car that you develop. And that's why I was really clear about the peer evaluation. We're not looking at the actual menu. We're not looking at the actual push-pull toy. We're not looking at the eating implement. We're looking at the process that you followed to come up with that design, because it's that process that's transferable. So that is a critical question, teaching them how to follow a process in the classroom. And then assessment, like how do you assess it? Because if I assessed you based on the product you created, I think that would be, I think there'd be a huge amount of inequity there. I think it would be quite subjective. And what am I actually assessing then in terms of the skills that you've developed as you've done that design project? And I'm only assessing one little element, and that's the actual production that you've done, and I'm not looking at your whole design process. So how do you assess that in the classroom? And obviously that means that your children have to document it, just like we've asked you to do so. In a prep class, it could just be using a little iPad and videoing it, photographing, recording voice. In a higher age classroom, it could be that they actually make something a little bit more sophisticated. And finally, you cannot do design projects without collaboration and discussion. It's when they have to sit down as a group or as individuals and articulate what they've designed for the other children in the class, that they really have to think deeply about what they've done. It's all very well thinking it, it's all very well writing that, but communicating that makes you really think about structuring what you've done and communicating. So collaboration and classroom discussion also is quite important. All of those points that Jones, Bunting and De Vries came up with will lead to some critical questions about your pedagogy. Yeah? And then moving one more, Lewis. Lewis is our creativity person. And Lewis said that it's critical and creative thinking through problem solving and invention that characterizes technologies. So if we're asking them to be critical and creative thinkers, I don't think we've got a problem with Peter 2s. I think we very often have a problem with 5s and 6s because we've actually knocked that out of them in the period of time they've been in school, because we've taught them how to do it. So yeah, in terms of creativity, it's important to identify when somebody says, I'm not creative. No, I can't paint a picture either, but I can find creative solutions to a problem through thinking. So again, it's about developing that creative process through thinking. That is the process of our classroom. How are we going to do that? That's a critical question. It's a very complex curriculum, isn't it? It's so rich with complex processes. Risk-taking, yeah. You know, nobody wants to take a risk. Nobody wants to take any chances. Nobody wants to try and do something that might not succeed. We all tend to plan projects that are easier to succeed at. So when you went in and you actually chose your design challenge, how many of you actually chose a design challenge because you thought you couldn't do it? How many of you actually chose your design challenge because you thought, oh, I can manage that one? So how do we teach our children then to say, I'm going to take that on because I actually think that's too hard for me, but I'm going to have a damn good go. Teaching them how to solve problems, teaching them how to take risks, teaching them how to identify problems, and then also how to motivate themselves. So, you know, that again, that's something new. Then, in your classroom, if you tell them too much about the domain knowledge, if you tell them everything there is to know about push-pull toys, so that there's no exploration, there's no problem finding, there's no problem solving, you really don't have a technologies classroom at all. How do you actually balance enough knowledge for them to build on so that through that they can develop their own creative insight into the processes? Terrible balancing act, and I get it wrong a lot with my groups of kids. Hands-on and open-ended obviously is critical, so you know that's a given in the technologies classroom. And then Lewis comes up with question marks that he feels that we haven't actually addressed yet. So this is something you may want to address as an area of focus in terms of problem-solving pedagogy. How are we going to teach problem solving? And the assessment issue he left open-ended. How do you actually assess creative thinking? You know, is there a yardstick? And amidst all of this, in terms of assessment in your classroom, how are you going to assess technologies on an ABCDE scale? And again, that's a critical question you may want to start asking. Okay, so that's basically what the readings have told us. And if you reconcile the readings then with your design process, with what the curriculum tells you, you should find two problems very, very easily that you can actually work with for that middle part of the assessment. Yep. Don't forget that middle part of the assessment needs to link to your readings. That's why I put those readings up there. So somewhere in those readings, I think it would be smarter to start with the readings, start with your project, and then bring them together to find those questions that link the two together. That's honestly not very complex. Looks complex, but it isn't. It's pretty straightforward. So we will have addressed then, up until this point, we will have addressed the process and production skills through your design challenge, and we will have addressed the content areas of the curriculum. So we're getting a long way towards actually understanding this curriculum, which is great. Okay, I just want to move a little step further and talk about makerspaces. Does anybody know what a makerspace is? Has anybody experienced makerspaces? Roz, you're nodding your head. Do you want to talk to us? Rosalind?
I work in early childhood, so we have a lot of maker spaces in our room for the kids to access, I guess, and explore. And especially outside, we have a lot of loose parts in
Great.
different buckets and things like that.
Awesome. So let me ask anybody who's involved in the year 5 to 6 age group, do we still have makerspaces in year 5 to 6? And I'm seeing nodded heads, shook heads.
No, I never saw it in my year 6 group.
Yeah, sorry?
No, I never saw it in my year 6 group.
Exactly. So it's problematic then with year 6s, and the pedagogy of makerspaces aligns so beautifully with what we do in design and technology that it's worth considering for your own classroom. So basically, a makerspace is where your children get together with a community of other people. Those other people can include, sorry, making big noise, can include experts and also each other, where they have some freedom and some structure to develop and make and design and evaluate and test and continue to make their own designs. And they're as simple as working with straws, as this little one over here. They're as simple as working with Lego, or they can be more complicated. This one's a woodworking project. And makerspaces will also stretch into high tech as well. So when we get into the second part of the course and we look at digital technologies, makerspaces more often than not are low tech, high tech, so they actually blend the low tech with the high tech. Now, I've got a silly little example here, and I think I ran the battery flat. But here, if I just find my camera, sorry, so that I know that you can see. It's a little robot, just a little robot with drinking straws holding them together. That's the low tech. And that's the high tech. It's catching a little bit, but his head basically moves because the high tech component is in the back of that, which is a little copper tape circuit with a microcontroller that the kids are programmed. And that's a little program, the project that these kids can do in year 4, year 5, very, very comfortably. And that would be a wonderful makerspace project. Now, it wouldn't be a good makerspace project if I gave them the recipe and said, make that robot and then wire it up and make his head move that way. What I would say to them is, here is my robot, this is what he does, put it away, see what you guys can come up with, and see if you can come up with a working robot. It doesn't have to be a humanoid robot. So that's what a makerspace is. Very often they run in libraries because a makerspace shouldn't be driven by curriculum. A makerspace should be driven by the interests of children. So very often schools actually put their makerspace in the library, and that's where the technology part of it really happens. So for instance, St. Aidan's down in Brisbane has got a makerspace, and the teachers will basically take the kids to the library for their library session. They might have done a, let's say, a storybook with a little scenario in the storybook, and the kids might go to the makerspace and actually make a model of one of the characters in that storybook and animate that character or whatever. So it tends to work very nicely with libraries particularly. But this is my little makerspace. I work with this in a Year 7 classroom, where they work with circuits. They work with copper tape circuits, which is exactly the same circuit as I've got behind that little robot. And they work with scrapbooking, and they actually, you can see the little lights over there. They actually illuminate their little scrapbooking circuits. A lot of them make shadow frames and things like that. Some of them do pop-up cards with lights in them, moving into e-textiles where they actually start sewing and putting together wearable fashion. So this is a little copper tape circuit, and the little girl involved wanted fireflies behind the trees. It's the same scene over there. They flash there, then they flash there, then they flash down there, and this is her circuit, and she's got it programmed. So that's that high-tech, low-tech, where the low-tech is actually the trees and the high-tech is little microprocessors here that she's programmed. And she's 11 years old, and she was very comfortable doing that. Here's another one, just started Year 7 at high school, and she's doing a paper circuit, but you can see the messiness of a makerspace. And here are some ideas for makerspaces. So I'm not necessarily saying that makerspaces are everything that you'll do in your technologies classroom. I am sort of suggesting that a makerspace is a wonderful way of teaching your technologies curriculum. And to put it into context, I've just finished on a grant from Ed Queensland on makerspaces in schools for technology education, and we're looking at another $200,000 to actually continue that grant to actually explore how you use makerspaces in schools for learning. So it's something that Ed Queensland is prioritising, and I know it's something that other authorities are prioritising as well. So somewhere in the mix of all of this, if you see a makerspace in your school or you hear somebody talk about makerspaces, it's something just to sort of grab onto and say, yeah, okay, I know a little bit about that. So I spent my life, if I take my little camera and make you well and truly see, collecting stuff. Cardboard, you can see the mess in my office, boxes, pom-poms, cardboard. I go to Spotlight every now and again, and when their flowers all get smushed up on the bottom of these shelves, they actually gather their flowers together, put them in a bag and sell them cheap. So I buy stuff everywhere I go and put it together. I went to Aldi a couple of weeks back, and I'll never pay full price, I'll just wait and see, and people don't have the value of these things. And here is a gorgeous little kit of components that are actually compatible with drinking straws. So they've got these little construction kits, and they're $20 each, which is, you know, really cheap. So I fill my room with materials. So you get little bits. Little bits are basically electronic building blocks, because you may have noticed the heavy emphasis in the curriculum on electronics. Little bits are quite expensive, but the lovely thing is that they're building blocks for electronics, and they're magnetic. So there's no wires involved, there's no soldering involved, they just snap the little bits together. And the lovely thing is that they're polar, so if you put the wrong side on, it won't snap and it won't work. So they get the sense that electricity goes in one direction. So again, those are quite, you know, useful little kits to get when you see them around. Construction kits like the one I've just shown you, building materials, cardboard, plastic, straws, fasteners. Makito is a really great little system. It's quite expensive, but it's there to actually fasten cardboard together to make things happen. I would recommend very strongly that you keep your Lego, because it's actually gains in value. But if you've got Lego and your kids are growing up, don't throw it away, keep it. And also put the word out in your school when you get out in your community that if people are finished with their Lego, they may want to actually donate it, because Lego, of course, is a fantastic construction system, and kids love doing it. There's nothing wrong with textiles and sewing in your classroom as well. That's using tools. Food and fibre production, looking at fibres, it fits in beautifully with fibre production, and weaving also. Also digital storytelling, and I don't know whether you're familiar with Lego Creative, but Lego Creative is actually a Lego kit very expensive, but your school might buy it for you. But it actually has all the props and pieces to actually make scenes for storytelling. So for literacy, to make a Lego creative scene and then actually use a green screen and film it is a fabulous way to go. Now, if you went high tech, you may get involved in robotics, and just about every school now should be involved in robotics. If your school is really upper echelon in terms of funding, you might actually have a 3D printer. They are not that hard to work with, and your kids love them. Makey is another lovely one. So these are probably words you're not familiar with, but do get familiar with some of this low-tech, high-tech, and we will talk about it next time. And just start thinking about the concept of having a makerspace in your classroom or your school, because it fits in with the curriculum so beautifully. So that's about it. That's all I wanted to go through today. So I'll just stop sharing. And that means I can actually... JCAR has great kits. Cheap shops are great too. Like every time I see little, stickers, bits and pieces, paper flowers, pom-poms, EVA foam, when it's nice and cheap, I buy paper and cardboard. I go around all my friends and say, have you got any scrapbooking stuff that you don't want anymore? Because we all did scrapbooking. And then everybody's got it stacked in their cupboards. So I've got lots and lots of paper punctions and things like that. You just collect your kit and you put it in a box, and then once you get into a school, whoopie-doo, and life is fantastic. So, yeah. You've all seen my hat, haven't you? And my shoes? Yes, no? Yeah, I think I showed them to you. I'll show them again. So again, these are the little things that these are my Year 7 students. That's just a hat from a cheap shop, but it's got little electronics components there, and the hat will actually, I'll turn the battery on, is programmed. So they can program their hats, they can program their shoes. I can turn the battery on again. So that they decorate their shoes or whatever. These are things, when I see a cheap pair of shoes, when they sell them when there's only one size left, I'll buy them. The little hat was $2 as, after New Year's Day. Bought that cheap. And then they can certainly do their own clothing with a little circle inside their own clothing. And they're stepping into Katy Perry territory with light up clothing, which is where they want to be. So there you go, guys. Gather all those materials, put them away. Every time you see something cheap, put it away, and you'll find electrical programs. That's it, Celine. Is that the one with the press studs? Yeah. I got mine from Aldi. They're about half the price of the ones you get on electrical catalogues. Yeah. So they love them. And the more of that you've got, the more you can actually... just develop your technologies classroom, because it's the materials that makes the difference. You don't have Aldi in Mackay? Serious? Oh. Well, just send me, if there's anything for sale, I'll advertise that as it goes. And yeah, we've got 3 in Bundaberg. So we're doing well. Yeah. Okay, so let's stop there. Okay, so peer evaluation, any questions? And are you comfortable working in your group of 4 and making sure that everybody in your group has actually got an evaluation and they're ready to move on? Now, in terms of your peer evaluation, that's probably going to be the one that you leave till last for your assessment. I would suggest this week, with the readings you've done this week and the fact that you already have learned about your process, I think this week you could actually write the middle part of that assessment. Yeah? Then it's done and dusted. Next week, we actually look at sustainability. I think next week you could do the 3rd part of your assessment and have it done. That'll be week 4. So that'd be awesome to have 2/3 of your assignment done. And then basically start on your first part of your assessment, and as soon as you get that peer evaluation in, just add that in to what you've already written about your design process, and you'll be able to step into that assessment and just stage it across 3 weeks now so that it's not a major issue. Okay, now, having said that, look, I've had a number of people with all sorts of, it's just things happen. There's one poor lady who's got surgery herself and a sick husband and kids at home. I'm not expecting anything from her in the next couple of days. So if you are delayed, because you are somewhat dependent on the peer evaluation, we'll be a little bit flexible with what you're doing. And if you've done the right thing and you've tried and you've engaged in the course and everything's late because that peer evaluation's taking time, we'll play with that in terms of timelines. You won't be disadvantaged because of that. But if you haven't finished yet, it is this week, Mel, so it's not due until the end of this week. That gives you week 4 to actually get the evaluation done. If you want to work faster and it's not happening, let me know. But apart from that, you know, if you're a bit late with it, I don't think there will be some people late, and they'll just fit in with you in a group because you'll have the same timelines. So that's all good. Yeah, the evaluations are supposed to be done next week, Mel. So some people are just stepping ahead of themselves. And yeah, they were due to be finished this week, and then evaluations done next week. In terms of your actual project, Amanda, everything should be finished. So investigating, defining, designing and making and evaluating should be finished this week so that somebody can actually get in and do that evaluation. Yeah, Fiona, although you can probably count on from the list because the list was put up after person number 30. So if you just count on to that list, yeah, you should be able to add yourself in. But I will update that tonight or probably tomorrow morning just to make sure that it's all up to date. And I'll keep doing that because, yeah, it didn't occur to me that we're going to have 200 people in that forum eventually. So we're just going to have an easier way of actually counting off people, and I'll commit to doing that so that you can find yourself in the forum. But do be aware also, like when you put your evaluate or your link up, you will find, you know, you'll keep in touch and see who's after you. Remember the person who's after you because they're the person you're going to evaluate, and then just search for them and you'll find them and find your place in the forum. Should be all good. Okay. So look, it's been very quiet recently. I think everybody's feeling a lot more comfortable now with the course and the assessment. You're all feeling really comfortable that it's not that huge anymore. It's actually quite a small task and a small assessment task, and it's more about getting your hands dirty and doing it than it is about learning about it. But it's a very easy assessment, this first assessment, and I don't think there'll be any problems. It's very individual. It's about your challenge and your ideas. So all good? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay, Roz, it'll be the person in front of you who posted before, the person who posted after you. You'll evaluate them. No? Don't confuse me. Wait. Hang on. I'll just go on a journey. There it is. Okay, so the first person in your group is going to evaluate the fourth person. The second person will come in, probably post their link and pick up person 1 to evaluate. The third person will come in, post their link and pick up number 2 to evaluate. The fourth person will come in, post their link and pick up the third person to evaluate. And the person number 1 is going to breathe a sigh of relief when they've actually got somebody to evaluate eventually with person number 4. Now, if you've done it in your group and it's in a different order, doesn't matter. There's only 4 of you to negotiate with. So, so just negotiate with somebody in your group if you've got a problem. So if we have a look at it, I put mine in, see they're rolling in beautifully, somewhere down here. Goodness, that's a lot, isn't it, since I posted? Oh, here it is. Okay, so I put in the first 30 people over here. So we're adding in up here, we've got extra people up top there. Okay, so I'll just tidy that up when we get to, I'll come up with multiples of 4 rather than breaking at 30. I'll break at 32 and then just bring in multiples of 4. Okay, so that means you don't have to go up and down and start counting what's happening. Okay, right, I'll stop recording.